Alright, gonna be ripping the whole bottom end of this thing out of this CR85. Got a new crank and gaskets and stuff for it. Top end was perfectly fine because that was pretty much new when it went in, so that's gonna be reused. But you can see that rod right there. He was riding this thing and it started making some horrendous noise. So what I'm gonna do to get this out is I'm gonna pop the flywheel off, and then I'm gonna pull the stator and everything out and just kind of swap it over to the side. What I'm gonna do is pull this out and disassemble it and put the new crank in it. So here is the gasket kit. Here's the new crank that's gonna be going in it. New crank bearings. And all right, so this is gonna be the fun part where the mess comes out of. But we got the bottom end out of the bike. You can see it looks pretty damn grimy and gross, but once I get this thing all taken apart, I'm going to power wash it and soak it in gasoline, scrub it real good, then power wash it again. So, well, let's hope that that's at the right angle. I can't get this thing to connect to my phone if my life depended on it. So I'm going to start tearing this thing down. Getting carried away with myself trying to take this case apart before I even got the clutch cover off. So what I like to do is make sure to take the parts off in the same order that they went on. So basically this one onto the case like that. Just zip tie them loosely together and toss that somewhere where you're not going to lose it. Same thing with the clutch and everything here. You got the bolt and everything here, which won't, it's not a normal nut that goes on the outer case like a lot of the bigger engines have. What I'll do is put a zip tie on it to hold everything together. It just makes it a lot easier to reinstall all this stuff and keep track of all the parts. Just throw that in there somewhere, put it somewhere. And you can see I forgot to drain the oil from the clutch side of this case, so I just completely ruined a bunch of rags. Jeez, I hope I didn't do this. I was looking at my phone, your camera again. Because you see, so only reason I'm that's stupid, so pain in the ass. So I can't get my phone works my camera. So I don't know if I'm actually getting shot, just clean it, all. So this, here's that. So you can do this as long as you're not going to reuse the crank. You're supposed to have a special tool that pulls the case halves apart. And basically what it does is it bolts on here and then it screws on here. And I can't remember exactly how it works. You tighten down these bolts, I think it is, and it pushes the crank out and it splits your case halves. But if you're not going to reuse the crank again, you can get away with doing this and lightly tapping on the transmission main output shaft. And then to put it all back together, what we're going to have to do is freeze the crank and the bearings all together. In order to install the new bearings on the new crank, I'm going to have to freeze the crank first, heat the bearings up, slide those on, make sure they're already all the way seated, and then put that whole assembly, the crank and the bearings together in the freezer. Freeze all that together, and then you either bake your case halves on like 300 for an hour or so, or what you can do is you can also, if you live in Arizona like I do, leave them in the sun all day and then freeze your crank and bearings and make sure you get yourself a can of air duster. Hold it upside down so as soon as it comes out of the freezer, you freeze the bearings and the crankshaft some more, and then everything should slide together, being careful not to forget about your center gasket and all that stuff. Almost forgot to disassemble one thing, which will be, there's a 12mm nut in there that I need to take out. Put that in there. See how I'm organizing everything? Got this with the clutch and everything, so that way I know where everything goes back together. I mean, this is a pretty simple engine, but it's still a very good idea to just make sure you keep an eye on where everything goes, just like what I'm doing now. You don't want to do that. Because see how I know how that went back together. Now that you have everything disassembled, so in order to get a transmission out of any case, you're going to need to remove this. It's going to be kind of tough. You're going to need an impact, or at least heat it up first for it to become loose, because these are Loctited in. So that's going to have to come loose. Sometimes you have to give it a good tap on this side because that bearing is kind of pressed in. But there it goes. You see everything kind of just drops out. Being careful not to get all the gears falling out of there. It's best if you can pull all this stuff out in one full assembly. As you can see, like what I'm doing now. And that'll make it easier to go back in. Because if the transmission comes apart, it's a pain in the ass to figure it out if you don't have the book for it. So what I'm going to do is put this back in as if it's in the bike still. And a lot of times what I'll do is I'll hold all this stuff together with a couple zip ties. Let's see if I can assemble this with a set of zip ties real quick. How I got all that put together, you can shake that around. It's really not going to go anywhere. I mean, obviously if you throw it around or whatever, it'd be too rough with it. It's already kind of coming apart, but you get the idea. Basically it keeps all the parts there so that way you don't lose anything and you know how it goes back together. Since this crank is not going to be used again, it is perfectly safe to hit it, but I'm going to have to heat it up in order to get it out. You can see it's coming. It's almost there. Working on it. Like I said, a little heat helps. Best thing you can do is heat this up, get it out. The idea is that the aluminum will heat up and expand a lot quicker than the steel will. There it goes. As long as you don't hit the case, don't mar up the edges or anything like that with the hammer. Just whack this a bunch until it comes. It looks like they had OE bearings in here. I can't tell. They look like OEM bearings actually. There's just a hot rod's crank. Yeah, those look like. They look like OE bearings because the hot rod's bearings will have plastic, but actually, check this out. You can actually see what was the failure point of this crankshaft. You see that bearing was starting to come apart. How much play is in there? Quite a bit. A little side-to-side play is alright, but that's a lot. And if you look down in there, you can see all the bearings are departed and stuff. But definitely that was I think that was the what caused the failure. You see those ball bearings in there, just kind of all over the place. Alright, so as you can see, I got these case halves cleaned up all the way, and they're basically ready to have the new bearings dropped in and everything. I'm not going to replace any of these bearings or anything like that because they're just fine. That's just extra work we don't need to do. If you're having trouble getting the bearing out, the main bearings, what you can do is basically use a blowtorch, heat up the back side right here, remove this seal first, heat it up, and get yourself a large socket, for example, like let's see here, what do we got? Like a socket like this kind of. You want to get yourself a socket like that after you get the seal out, and then heat up the case around the bearing race basically, and give it a good smack. It'll probably take a few good whacks to get it out. What you don't want to see is when you take the case halves apart, you don't want to see the bearings just kind of slide out, because that means that your cases are worn out at that point. Here's the new bearings. In case you're looking for bearings, I highly suggest you get an OEM brand new crankshaft and an OEM brand new set of main bearings to do this. So here's the part numbers for the bearings. They are both the exact same on each side. So you'll see, got those from Rocky Mountain. They're $16 a piece. And then if you look right here, this is going to be the part number for the crankshaft. That is a genuine Honda crankshaft. I don't suggest you going and getting a Hot Rods crank or Wiseco crank or anything like that. Just go with an OEM crank. But yeah, so I've got the crankshaft in the freezer right now. I'm letting it freeze overnight. And then the bearings tomorrow, what I'm going to do is I'm going to heat them up and drop them onto the crankshaft. And hopefully have this together tomorrow. You'll see that in the next part.